Are journalists failing to connect the dots? Are we rising to expectations? Are we rising to challenges? Are we rising to our responsibilities of covering climate change, the critical issue of our time? It's not going to leave anybody unaffected, and it certainly impacts all economic sectors. You have been introduced to the panel. So let me first start by identifying or establishing where you all stand on this matter, because if you think we're doing a stellar job, then we can just pat ourselves on the back and go to the delegate lounge and have coffee and wait for the next session. So Aruna, 10 years ago or so, I had a young friend, a reporter, come to me for mentorship advice, asking what she should do. And I told her at that point of time, very authoritatively, that focus on health or the environment, because India is sitting on a ticking time bomb, and this is going to be the hot beat in journalism, and this is what you need to just focus on. And 10 years have come and gone, and ironically, or it just confounds me that really hasn't happened. It's been like a waiting for Godot moment. Unlike Nitin, there are very few organizations, big organizations, that will back you up and have a separate beat for the issue of environment and climate change.
Yeah, 10 years ago or 8 years ago was when I was somehow the news of Operation Green Hunt, and that was during the Congress era, started making its way to my Facebook feed way back. Sorry, just doing product placement for our sponsors. But, and at that point, then learning of the different crises that were going on in the country, it's not as if movements, environmental movements haven't been on forever, and resistance against land and acquisition for forests and water, that these conflicts that have been going on in different parts of the country. And also at the same time, you had journalists like, again, Nitin also reporting on the various dilutions that were happening from UPA 2 onwards and much before. Climate itself seems like an extremely ignored beat, because you don't have climate journalists, aside from niche publications, such as India Climate Dialogue. You might have Down to Earth kind of covering it, but you don't have dedicated people covering the subject, versus in the US, you have Vox, you have got NYT, and all of the other big publications that have people solely dedicated towards covering climate. So I feel like it's kind of been left on the shoulders of freelancers and who are pitching this. You've got people in business papers such as Nitin, you've got Hridesh, but then it's almost as if you can identify on one hand who are these reporters. And they're often saddled with other stories to do, and it's not seen as, but then, I mean, of course, it's not like you've got heat waves, you've got floods, you've got drought. There's more than enough material and not enough editorial interest to kind of cover it. So I think we're doing a pretty shite job. Yeah.
So I disagree with you on the US bit, because I do feel, especially since economic downturn since 2008, all newsrooms have been facing the crunch, and the first to go have been the more intensive beats like foreign reporting for one, environmental reporting and investigative reporting. But Nitin, the UN climate change report has said we have 12 years to do some drastic slashing of greenhouse gas emissions. That is a looming deadline. It is just of such great proportions. And as this youth, the climate change activist, Greta Thunberg, has said, that if that really should be forcing all of us to not cover any other story except for climate change. Yet, even when that report came out, for example, one study has said that only 22 papers in the US actually covered, out of the top 50 American newspapers, actually covered that story. So why is that, if we're saying that climate change is so critical and it affects every industry? Because if you look at your body of work, you see that climate change is connected to everything. Business, climate change, human rights, climate change, women, every sector.
So, actually, I'm not so pessimistic about it. I find, to absolute contrary, I think Indian journalism's done a stellar job in covering issues of environment and climate. I say that in the context of where journalism in India generally stands. We know we are thoroughly incapable of writing on particularly the corporate world. We are, our business models are really not capable of addressing challenges of how to report on, how would I say, rougher ends of society or tougher ends of society. Our capacities in each of the sections where we look at, whether it's finance, economy, health, per se, our journalism is pretty, and this includes me, I think, is pretty pedantic. We've never been a great journalistic venture in India so far, I believe. Our abilities since the 90s, when our economy grew at such rapid spaces, our journalism has not been able to keep tab. In that context, I think individual journalists in various places and institutions have done a spectacular job with very limited resources at their disposal. Also, I think too often we kind of use the language which comes from an Anglo-Saxon world of what climate change is. I would presume anyone who writes on health in general, anyone who's writing on corporate malfeasance at large, anyone who's roughly looking at environmental regulations, public health issues, they're anyway doing a yeoman service without actually using the word climate change every time in their reportage.
But is there a need to make the connection? So when we talk about
I
floods,
don't think so, really. I think it's a little overblown. I think particularly in cases of countries like India and developing countries at large, a lot of what we will pass off, end up passing off, thankfully we don't do at the moment as climate change, is really just governance failures, which would happen regardless of whether climate change was happening or not. Climate change would perhaps end up exacerbating the consequences of that malgovernance.
Yes.
So I think too often actually climate change, and I see this, and I don't know if I'm passing a judgment on all of us, actually use climate change as an excuse to not point out malgovernance. Everything turns into climate
Correct.
change.
Fair enough.
It's stupid. Very often we know it's just bad governance, bad planning, which is part of us, which is part of a developing country's story and the nature of our political economy. I think it's fair to, I mean, I've done comparisons, looked at Brazil particularly, and say Indonesia and China. These are large economies, roughly our size or slightly bigger, or much bigger in some cases. And actually you find we do spectacularly well. I don't think, again, I think the keywords we are searching for when we say, oh, when somebody researcher comes in, does India report on climate change, we'll go and look for that hashtag. It does not exist. People anywhere in rural India in different languages are covering droughts, all the troubles that exist with all the changes in the environment, regardless. And they've been doing it much better than English media for the last 20 years anyway, I think. We've been doing a little bit of governance policy sitting in Delhi in English media, but largely I think I'm quite... Can we do better? Obviously. You give us a little more money and a little more resources, but that's true for all beats, right?
Correct.
I'm sure you gave much more resources to a health reporter, he or she would do as spectacular a job.
I agree, but I do think that health and environment requires more time, more research, and the nature of the industry right now where we are in media doesn't, it's not made for that kind of investigative journalism. The audience's attention spans have also gone down, where everyone's moving online. But basically the point is we have a debate because we have one panelist who agrees and one panelist who disagrees. So that is a good start. But Sanjay, first, I want to go across to you. You are a lawyer, environmental lawyer, and you have set up India's first environmental law firm. How is that going? Is business good? Should I have told that young journalist who came to me, forget environmental journalism and go into environmental law?
I don't know about the business, but certainly the field is growing. It's needed. I don't know what you mean by it's going good. The environment is not going good. So, and as Nitin just said that, being a lawyer and seeing the issue of the subject of the day, I think good litigation also makes news. And somehow climate litigation is very notional in India. If you see, the National Green Tribunal or the Supreme Court, I don't think our judges or lawyers, for that matter, understand this subject at all. We all relate climate change to disasters, floods. We're talking about floods in Vadodara now and floods in Assam. So everything is related to a disaster. But I think what is missing is what is the making of the disaster? And I think that's where we have failed in some ways. So there I slightly disagree with Nitin that we haven't really gone into the reasons. Of course, there are governance failures and so on. But as a legal fraternity, I think we're also partly to be blamed because we haven't got these issues debated very strongly, and there are reasons for that. a smile fraternity which understands it very little, and more importantly, the people sitting at the top of the table, the honorable judges, so to speak, they are far removed from these subjects if you look at it. I mean, in all, we've had about 3 cases, 2 in NGT. Again, I would call it very notional. One, the judge felt that something was happening in Rohtang Pass, and therefore you should not allow some vehicles to go, and that is going to affect the glaciers of Himalayas. Pretty far-fetched, but that was his wisdom. And then one 9-year-old girl, very notionally, because somebody in Pakistan, a nice judge called Mansoor Ali Shah, gave a judgment about ensuring climate change, policy changes that should happen in Pakistan. So we also notionally gave to the NGT a particular cause for giving some little bites on climate change. So largely the legal fraternity and the judicial fraternity has been rather, I would call, indifferent. You know, there are the climate skeptics, there are climate advocates, and there are climate ignorant or indifferent. I think lawyers and journalists mostly come to the third category. We hardly know enough about it to report, but that's the...
I deny that.
I completely deny that.
But I think also it's the job of the journalist then to, be able to inform the viewer and transfer that legalese into simple understanding for the viewer, whether eventually it's the judge that's reading it on the papers or watching it on the TV or whatever, but that's where the role of the journalist comes in. But you are also part of the Forest Governance Learning Group, and talking about this somewhere, you said that you have a support group of journalists who report on the environment that can, then publish or talk about the findings of your report or whatever, or the studies. Are there enough environmental journalists, you think?
Well, there are. I mean, people like Nitin have grown in stature since the day I knew him. There are a lot of people like him who are out there.
Is there mass?
He has mentored a few, I know. No, I don't think en masse there are journalists who you can find anywhere. But I think I agree with Nitin that you don't really have to know the language of the climate debate in the world to be a climate journalist. Even if you are serious enough knowing the issues around environment in general and what's happening with the governance models or how we are doing things, I think it's good enough to take the issues, and that's what we are doing as environmental lawyers. We are bringing issues to the courts and ensuring that some things happen from all sides, whether it's the government, whether it's the corporates, or whether it's the activists bringing issues. So that's what we are attempting to. But in terms of reporting, I don't think the reporters whom I meet on a daily basis, for example, who hover around NGT or the Supreme Court, I don't see them really working enough on these issues. I mean, it's like the way we are driven by client, they're driven more by editors, and that's the thing I see a lot.
Of course.
Happening. Despite the interest of the journalist, she suddenly moved out somewhere, which she may or may not want to be.
That's the reality on the ground. But so, okay, we've established where everybody stands. Now, let's talk about the challenges, why, what. Nitin, from 1980 to 1990, we established climate change, the risks as climate change would come up. But in the 10 years, not much has been done about it. And now we are at a time where politics is so polarized. You have a US president who has stacked his administration with climate change skeptics. In Brazil, home to the Amazon forest, you have a right-wing president who has a foreign minister who says climate change is a Marxist something. And back home, we have a prime minister who says the climate hasn't changed, we have. So is it difficult to report on tough issues in a tough time?
No, actually, it's fun. I mean, you've got these people who are not actually saying, they're telling truth to the face of what their politics is. It actually helps you. It was much more difficult in my experience, say, when President Obama was heading US administration, to actually report on his hypocrisy because his words would be far away from his actions. And to admit that the large set of climate diplomats in the US and their main key heads continue to be the same in the Trump administration as they were in the US. So there's no change per se, just that Trump's actually allowed a little more criticism because he's upfront about his politics. Prime Minister Modi, on the other hand, I find is far more complicated a character. He's vacillated from a point where he said, it's all about if you go to the Vedas, you do a little yoga, it'll sort itself out, to the point of having then gone over to the other side and said, he wants to reclaim the space of saying, I am the leader globally on climate change, and he's done that along with China to some extent. Also fairly so. India does at this moment is in the front end of leadership on climate change issues internationally. I think what we forget is it is technically possible to do very well on climate change and completely screw up on domestic governance at the same time. It's entirely possible to reduce your emissions at substantial levels and yet have huge amount of malgovernance in the environmental frames and livelihood frames in India. These two can go in hand concomitantly, and we've seen this across the world. It can happen. So I think sometimes a little disagreement with Sanjay here. I think it's really difficult and at the same time very important to understand that climate change is not like a domestic pollution issue. So to give you a very anecdotal example, when we run our diesel cars, we put out something called sulfur dioxide, or SOx as they are called. It's not the SOx, but SOx. And the more SOx you put out, actually you reduce the amount of the impact of emissions on your global warming. So if you take out diesel fuels, you actually add more problems for yourself on the terms of climate change. So it is a complex field. It does require, and I think journalists like me have failed largely because at least when we began covering environment, we were just stupid tiger writers. We were all doing this little, what I call animal porn in some sense. It took us time to understand that we need to understand energy systems, we need to understand global finance, we need to understand this complexity of the science, we need to understand the impacts is the easiest part to write on, I believe, because it's something that we lend ourselves to. This standard story of saying, oh, what's happened to the poor fellow, is something that lends ourselves easy because it actually does not require us to understand the complexities of the energy economy systems. So in some sense, there's a valid reason why we have not moved far ahead in the last 10 years, because it is difficult to move it. So I could say, again, I'll end with this example. You could do 100 gigawatts of renewable as India plans to do, near about reach it. You could at the same time be adding another 50 gigawatts of coal and still be happy. And you still meet your international targets. You could increase your targets and still be able to do this.
But has the journalists then failed to bring this to light? Because if you're
Absolutely.
talking about how the foreign media perhaps may be embracing the Prime Minister, saying that, India is now leading on the fight, global fight on climate change. But on the ground, for example, PM says development and environment are not mutually exclusive. We are in a stage right now in India, Aruna, where we have a government which doesn't share information. We have a government that doesn't give interviews, doesn't do press conferences. And when the PM makes a statement like this, the media is now the PR agency that takes the statement, publishes that, and doesn't follow up with on the ground checking if that is really true. Like if, railways have been allowed to go through forest tracks, anything. What is their track record on that front?
So I think in terms of the fact that, of course, disagree with Nitin on the sense that, yes, covering the impacts is easy. It's not easy. It's not easy when you're doing it on your own resources. And I think it's important because you do need to show people what is expanding coal mine looking like. What is the fallout? What is it? What do flood impacts? And is it a misgovernance issue? Is it a climate issue? What are those human faces? I think while it's extremely important and I have immense value for reading between the lines and understanding and breaking down how those policy changes occur, I think being able to capture that, to be able to speak to people and also hold local authorities to account to determine whether it's a misgovernance issue, is it a climate issue, is it then looking at forest diversion and things like that as well, trying to cross-check what you see in documents, speaking to people about their experience around it. Might seem easy, but then these are also things that you're not getting budgets to go and cover. That especially this is something that freelancers face to a large extent. Most bureaus, we had reporters from the mainstream press who used to be based in states that are seeing heavy amounts of industrialization. They've been shunted out. So I think a large amount of that coverage seems to rest with, and we know a handful of reporters who are doing excellent work, and those are growing in number and not necessarily motivated by editors. These are reporters motivated by what they're seeing around them and engaging with the environment, pushing those stories, having them killed at the pitch stage. And and again, these are people who, the few of them who do hold down jobs are frustrated, and more of them want to freelance because they're like, if you can't name names, if you can't name polluters or violators, but you are in the mainstream press, what is the actual point? And when it looks to TV, that these are not investigations that are being carried out. Standing in a flooded street in Bombay is not climate coverage. On that front, I definitely do agree. I mean, brave reporters, yes, covering the floods, yes, you're wearing your raincoat and in the breeze, yes, that's important. But yeah, that isn't, and it's only if it's in a major city close to a studio. We did one series once, and therefore we can pat ourselves on the back. I think there's a lot more to be desired.
And if you can't make the connections, then are we failing ourselves? But it's, you've mentioned also before, and I agree that, you've mentioned that much of the burden of environmental reporting falls on freelancers. You're a freelancer, you're an independent journalist. We've seen across the board, internationally and in India, newsrooms are facing a crunch, and the first to go are investigative journalists, the more intensive hardcore beats where you have to spend more money. Advertisers are now spending their money elsewhere. We have the audience moving to free information and free news available online, at which point I should remind you, News Laundry's tagline is you have to pay for news if you want it to be free.
Still waiting on checks.
Yet at the same time, you're saying you choose to go and work independent. Would it not be better and easier, especially if you're covering serious investigative environmental journalism stories, to have the backing of a big company, of a big media organization?
Show me those that you can trust to run critical stories. Some of them do, and hats off to them, and the few that do. But it's annoying that you get applause. Oh, wow, you decided to write about a certain corporate house. Wow, this... No, we should all be pushing and pushing back. These are very obvious things that we realized when this government came into power, that you would have and see more of the dilutions. Not that, I mean, it's the UPA 2 on steroids. And I think that should have been the lens from the get-go. Big media houses, I don't know, when was the last time, including NDTV, had a discussion or sent out investigations. So it's big media houses backing you. Sometimes some places are lucky.
I think they're few and far between. I can speak from my own experience because NDTV invested enough to have 2 reporters and a whole team travel. We went from Kutch in Gujarat all the way to the Sundarbans. All I'm saying is, they don't need to do it. It's a lot of money. That money can be used elsewhere, and they don't have to. They did. But across the board, there's a crunch, and it's affecting all fields, especially, I think, in investigative journalism and environmental journalism. I would just want to talk about the craft once. Are we still in a stage where, the first tenet of journalism that you learn in journalism school is that every side has 2 stories, and you have to give equal weightage to both camps in the debate? When we talk about climate change, are we still at that stage, or have we moved on?
Sorry? Go ahead. Both sides to this story. But yeah, no, as in getting a company response is essential, or speaking to the other sides. You don't need to give deniers more space. That's something that's, we shouldn't be at the stage where we are asking people, do you believe in climate change? That's extremely basic. I think we need to move beyond that. But yeah, I mean, speaking to all sides is fairly important. I think that's a basic tenet of journalism. But then there's also science. And I find that, like, people might criticize you as being, an activist or a Luddite or someone who's anti-science for covering climate change. This is the only country where I see that happen on an extremely regular basis, where Editors Guild people seem to attack activists for saying that, okay, no, firing on a bunch of protesters is a bad idea, the anti-development.
Especially in India, maybe, Nitin, that you can be branded as an activist. If you're an environmental journalist, do you get that? I often get it on We the People when we cover these issues, that you'll be told, oh, you're anti-development, or implying that, oh, you're an activist, you can't be taken seriously, you're biased, you've come from a biased point of view.
Yeah, that's true, I think. I mean, but that's also true in general. If you see any journalist in any field who's actually written honestly and not said, oh, our political economy is corrupt, but actually said these 4 people are corrupt, you'll at the end of 2 weeks find somebody or the other have branded them as activists. So it's also generally, I think, our nature of journalism is really pedantic. I mean, we are all part of it, and I think we should agree. We are far from a mature journalistic fraternity with the independence to actually take names when it requires. The moment we take it, it's always easier to brand them right, left, center, whatever activist, and therefore dismiss their work. And this is true across the board. But that said, I think the only difference I find, say, and I wanted to say this earlier as well, is, say, compared to particularly the Anglo-Saxon journalism on climate change and environment, we don't have a debate here whether climate change exists or not. That's an Anglo-Saxon fundamental problem. Nobody here actually has an argument saying we don't have climate change. So we are on a far better.
You have the health minister saying, it's not a problem.
Yeah, but the poor chap's also trying to run a scheme to saying, no, I'll do something. It's really, we are far better, I think, than, say, particularly the US, marginally from the Europe also, in the way we address as journalistic fraternity. Forget the governments. I think they all vary and warped in their own ways and unique ways. But I think as journalistic fraternity, we've been very good at, from very early on, at very low income levels, generally in the economy, of having covered these issues very well and done it with great rigor. The contrast I give always is I work in a business paper and I've done a lot. My other side is looking at public finance. The amount of people in journalism and outside who work like a watchdog on the environmental beat, there is not 1/100th of that on public finance, which is actually impacts everything as much. So if I work on GST and looking at how the taxes are being collected, you will not find a whistleblower. It took me 6 months to find one whistleblower inside the system. It's much easier to work on the environmental field because India has had since, I think, 60s and 70s, a very active watchdog community at the community level, as well as at an intellectual level, sitting in cities, in think tanks, etc. So we are very well endowed. I don't think any other country that I would imagine actually has such an active watchdog at such a level of the economy.
Then again, I think it comes back to the question, are the journalists then picking up on this? So you have the activists, you have people on the ground doing all of, whatever it is, the movement of picking it up. Has a journalist picked up the story? Sanjay, as a non-journalist over here, come in over here, whether it was in the US, Donald Trump, when he was elected, it was the hottest year on record or whatever. You have the presidential debates, you have the moderators are all journalists. Nobody asked him one question on global warming. In India, for example, we've just had an election. Pollution has been a serious issue for all of us. None of the manifestos really touch upon it, and no journalist questions them or raises them or makes it an election issue in our coverage. Do you agree or disagree?
No, I agree. In fact, I'm not as optimistic and as Nitin is about how well we are covering these issues. And I think we need to be bothered about how deep we are getting into the subject. I mean, I don't know how many journalists know how national communication is done to the world of how we are performing on environment and climate change. So there's one officer sitting in the Ministry of Environment and Forest, a gentleman called J.R. Bhatt, whom you probably know. But how many people know that he's the node for India to give the national communication to the world? What kind of consultative processes the government is doing today, and how you guys are picking those bites from the world, from around the country, to ensure that the reality actually is communicated. I think there is a climate posturing, if I can understand that debate a little more, that we do to the outside world, and then there is a climate reality that we have to face on a daily basis. And I think we haven't really distinguished the two. And I think journalists, and the fourth estate, the powerful that you are, you should be talking about a lot of these things. No, I mean, very simple thing like, no, you're supposed to be. Very simple thing like state action plan on climate change. We have invested millions and millions of rupees trying to develop that plan state-wise. With all the foreign donors helping us to make the right language, etc. But I don't see anyone covering how a state action plan on climate change is affecting Nagaland, for instance, or Manipur, for instance.
Let's bring in
We covered it.
Craft. Okay, let's bring in Craft over here. How do you cover this? Because we know we have the facts, we have the figures, we have the solutions. Now, do we need to have a more interesting way to disseminate this information now? Do we need to make it more interesting? Because let's admit, you said in the beginning, you don't need special, training or a science background or anything like that to cover environmental journalism. I disagree. I think it's much more complicated. I think the audience has a shorter attention span, and we have to make these stories more interesting.
So
Does the fault lie now in us
in terms
not
of
being able to-
storytelling, I mean, like I've used VR films to try and like get people to place themselves inside a fly ash pond and using Instagram stories or doing photo exhibits. I think you can play with the format as much as you want to, and then there are so many stories to be able to tell and tell from different perspectives. What I think is missing is, of course, is how much editorial support are you going to get? I think you can play with it. You've got as many different mediums. People are doing Insta lives, and lots of young people are engaging, wanting to get into the field, are doing an incredible job of actually covering it. So I do think, yes, of course, storytelling and connecting the dots is essential, because breaking it down sometimes policy critiques. But I was also wanting to talk about, like, I mean, of what Nitin said, like at one level of the fact that public finance, and you were talking about state climate action plans, of how this money, this finance has been diverted, how states are being asked to beg for relief funds, how that's politically being managed, like trying to understand the funding aspect of it in terms of what's available. I find that at some level also understanding GST and how people seem that our climate backup fund was diverted was the story that Nitin had also done, also focused on, and seeing how our essentially our life raft was diverted to GST, and for environment reporters to be decoding finance essentially, and also what business reporters should have been doing, that these mining reporters should have been covering large parts of it. There are some excellent ones as well. Meera Mohanty from Economic Times. You've got people covering it, but then you don't have, if that's your beat, if you're covering big business, you should be asking these questions as well. Why is it all on the shoulders of environmental journalists? I mean, those are also angles that we're looking at, and there's more than enough. Looking at, of course, like global finance versus domestically how much money we have, there are more than enough angles to cover, and lots of people doing it. I think the question is in terms of where is that editorial support from the mainstream willing to run with it?
Editorial support, you've mentioned that. Sanjay, you've also mentioned editorial support. So I just want to play devil's advocate. Are we passing the buck onto the editor, saying that, look, we may pitch a story, the editor shoots it down, saying environmental stories don't get enough clicks, people aren't interested, the public's not interested? Because if you see, like this, for the past year, you've had all these Greta Thunberg from Sweden and that Alexandria, all these youth activists. In the US, some 700, many thousands and thousands of school kids not going to school on Fridays, protesting because of climate change. That is the audience, the demographic that media houses, publishers, editors are trying to grab. The youth who we're saying are not interested in news, are all not, subscribing to papers anymore. They're all going online. So is this a, like an easy option for us journalists to say, we want to do this story, but the editor doesn't allow me to go ahead? Because it sounds like there is an interest. The youth, certainly, the next generation is interested.
I think I agree with you quite a lot on this one. We are thoroughly incompetent, I believe. After years, I find all the stories I've done, say, 2 years ago, I'd like nobody to ever read them. I realize how trashy they've been in terms of my understanding of the subject. That said, I think it's a complex challenge in the sense, these are not, when you address climate change, you're not addressing a single beast in the room. You are addressing a pack, which requires a response from a pack of journalists. As Aruna's rightly saying, I think we need to, and it's a fact that we need to skill up ourselves as environmental journalists to understand, again, a lot of things we never did or never needed to begin with. We also need to skill up our journalists and colleagues who cover other areas, who are fantastic in what they do, but they just don't have this pair of spectacles they wear when they look at other things. Say, as Aruna was saying, whether you're looking at industry, finance, health, if they were allowed to wear those spectacles once in a while, and that's where the editor becomes an enabler. If that was happening, then it would be a fun run. But again, I'm sorry if I sounded too optimistic to begin with. I lost my first job for doing this kind of work in the UP era. I lost my second job 2 years ago, again for doing the same kind of work in what was supposedly a more progressive organization. So even after that, I'm quite happy. I think with the limited abilities we have, and we have very limited abilities, I think we've done a great job. Will it expand? The only way to expand is, I think, to get the newsrooms thinking differently. I think it's important that we admit that unless journalism per se moves up a notch, environmental journalism will remain a notch below that. And that's a fact, and that's true. Again, the optimism for me comes out of the fact that when I look at a large fraternity outside in Europe and US covering climate change, I think developing country journalists per se have been a much better lot because they were attuned to these issues from a livelihood perspective, from the issues of conflict from the very beginning. A lot of European journalists particularly, I find, are completely lost in handling this when it comes to what the consequences are for everyone else except them. I think there's been a great, if you look internationally, some of the best work on climate change has happened outside the North. It's happened in the Global South. It's been done by journalists with very little resources from the Global South, with some amount of funding, etc., available from the Global North, which we don't have. That said, again, my last point, I think there is a challenge that very often now when the funding comes, particularly for, say, freelance work, I'm probably the last 3 remaining were secure in their jobs as environmental journalists. I think 3 more resigned in the last 4 months or so. We need to generate domestic resources because the international resources come to help us write for them. And that audience is different. Their understanding of us is different. They need to be grounded down to the basics. We are not allowed to write to the granularity that we should be doing. There's also a degree of voyeurism that comes in when you write for an American audience or a European audience. You're not writing to make a change. You're writing to tell a fantastic story that enthralls everyone and just challenges and creates a little bit of exotica around that. Does it get better with time? Yes, it does. I mean, I remember when I joined in 2007, Times of India, and I was trying to do this, there were 3 of us doing it. Now we've got 40 freelancers chugging at it, giving at it. There are at least 10 other journalists in newspapers pushing it. Television media is different. I think television media, it's actually seen the demise of environmental journalism in the last 10 years. It's gone down, it's gone worse. But I think that, again, I'm sure you'll validate, is a larger factor of journalism actually disappearing from TV media to begin with. Reportage has gone off. So I think put together, there's a mixed bag. But are we better than last 10 years? Yes, we are. We are far more capable of holding the government responsible than we were. Do we need to skill up? Immensely. Will we be able to do it? I don't think my generation can. I think we need a younger generation which is much more skilled. I've taken 15 years to learn what the power sector is. I think the next set of people who come and can do it in the first 3 years will be far more sophisticated in handling this.
Talking about losing 2 jobs, I do want to touch upon the risks that environmental journalists face. We should, but I also know we're one of the beginning sessions of the day, so we have to stick to time, and I'm being told let's try and see if any audience questions. If not, we can close on that issue.
Being a sort of environmental journalist myself, you were talking about storytelling, and I wanted to ask you a specific question on that. In Tamil, we have a saying, and I'm just going to translate it for you, which it basically means that only when you're hit in your stomach will you actually react. And only when people react, the public react, will the government actually take action. So why are we unable to tell a story about climate change which your target audiences will understand as it hitting them in the stomach? Whether it's pollution, whether it's deforestation, whatever it is. Why are we unable to tell? We're all storytellers. We should be able to do it, right? Especially mainstream, regional language media, because this is an entirely English language panel. So it should be regional media that is telling the story. Do you think we're capable of that? Do you think we should be doing that?
I asked this question because I think that's where we're failing. I think the challenge is, I believe that reporting on the environment is harder than reporting on other issues, and the challenge that we have to rise to is to be able to report it in a manner that the audience, that it touches a chord with the audience. This is the first thing you learn in journalism school, and I believe that we have lost it. It is more complicated when you have facts, figures, numbers. How do you tell that story without losing the audience, or without speaking only to the converted who are interested in that? We need to move beyond just those who are going to buy, who subscribe to Down to Earth or whatever. And it is more complicated. You need more time. The nature of the industry is, at least with TV right now, is there's these deadlines on your case all the time. You have to file. You can't go in depth. And you have to also... It's not that complicated.
Yeah, I disagree. It's you can do a quick story. You can, of course, and I think that there's so much of a playing field. You're going to talk about forest diversion. You have communities. You have landscapes that people can see, identify with. You have things that are tied to your own existence. You can bring and strike that chord. Yes, the numbers and the figures. Yes, a lot of my friends complain, yeah, your million tons per annum, I don't understand this when you're talking about coal and things like that. I mean, can you break that down? And it's something that I've also been learning and thinking about is how do you tell that, how do you make those statistics come alive? It's unfortunate that the kinds of complex dilutions that this government does and how do you break down how that law changed and make that something that people are able to see the significance of. That's a challenge, yes. And that's something that you just getting people to understand that it is, and that's where the fun lies, to be honest, to get people to care about it, because it's so intrinsically connected, and there's actually so much that you can do in how you portray and yeah, the kinds of landscape.
Can I just make a comment on this? As a layperson, it's also, yeah.
Layperson, it seems.
No, sitting amidst all popular journalists, how do you tell your story? I mean, I think one thing is, are we telling the stories which are positive? Because I think people are sick of negative stories all the time. I don't think we are really covering successes in very remote places. I don't know why people don't write about the Paiko hydels in Nagaland, or people don't write about the village-scale biodiesel program in Mahuda village in Bahrampur in Odisha. People, and that takes a lot of resources perhaps. That's one. The second point is how much people believe you as a journalist when you write about these specialist subjects. You know, when Ravi Chellam today writes in Hindu, maybe a lot of these sector people will take notice. Oh, Ravi Chellam is talking about Forest Rights Act, which is a forest rights for the dwellers, rather than conservation of tigers that he's been talking about. So people might take notice. So it's also about the stature of the journalist and how much people believe in them.
So when you say positive stories, maybe also solution stories. When we cover climate change, maybe we provide the solutions.
We don't cover that enough, is what I'm saying.
But Sanjay, I have a quick, sorry, Ritesh, one. Climate change, as much as we talk about the crisis, it's also a huge opportunity, and especially for business houses, and it's a moment of, are we not in a moment of cusp? Do you have clients who come to you asking how they can maybe gain from this? Because things have to change at some point. You have to move to, I don't know, renewables or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about renewables, for example, and we are still stuck in the Indian Electricity Act, for example. From 2007, we've been trying to make a law on renewable energy. We still don't have it. So, I mean, these are opportunities also, but we haven't done enough on that. I mean, we keep talking about the problem, but if you look at the solution side, at least from the law and policy standpoint, we hardly have done enough. At least that's my
Sorry,
view.
this was supposed to be for audience, so I'm not going to eat into your time. Go ahead, Ritesh.
No, I just wanted to make a comment. You said positive stories. I don't have as much theoretical knowledge as Nitin and other people have here. I've been always mostly on the ground, but I have seen that in the quest of telling the positive stories, we should not fall for the propaganda of government. That is also very important. Just giving a quote. A story was given to journalists by an official report of government's forest survey report, which said that government forests are increasing. I come from Uttarakhand. This government has annihilated 100,000 trees, which is very conservative data I am giving you, and ravished all the rivers, houses of the people for a useless Char Dham highway, which is not going to give any employment to anyone, at least to the people who live there. Another thing about the tigers, I don't think the figure being provided to us is it's an inflated figure. There are many things which we are witnessing today. Those journalists have to investigate, irrespective of the people say negative story, because positive thing, government has a lot of propaganda machine to do that.
As I refer to it in an op-ed, this is Pavan Muktasana for the international press. That's what Modi is up to.
No, but I was not talking about the programs of the government. I was talking about positive stories per se.
Can I try and respond to both the lady who was there and she's, I think, got exasperated and walked off?
No, she's right here.
I think the challenge for a lot of us when we write on climate change is actually, it's not a black and white story of hitting somebody's stomach. It's a very complex debate between our desire to do well as society economically, at the same time do it sustainably. There are trade-offs. There is no black and white to this. It is a tough call. To give you an example, I think most of you will know. You don't want to have coal in India. It's really toxic for a lot of societies. You cannot have hydropower in India because it displaces large amounts of communities. You will not risk having nuclear power plants in dense populations, fairly so. Where do you go? You have intermittent solar. If you put up 100 gigawatts of it, it only produces equivalent to around 20 gigawatts of coal. And it's going to be upfront capital costs are much higher. There are difficult decisions that governments have to make to transit to that. It's difficult, therefore, to address some person's challenge who's actually suffering right on the ground, as what Aruna reports very often, saying he or she is hit by coal dust, and to tell that story, lead it from there to the point where you say, damn it, the government will end up killing a few million people regardless of what they do. Even when they do their best on renewable, we will see excess of coal in the next 30 years. And to say it, not demonizing anyone, saying these are rough challenges that no other country has done any better than us so far. We are screwing up in our own unique way. Other countries have done it in their own unique way, and that's perhaps the story. It is not easy. It is also complex to take it from the point where something happens on the field to the point of explaining that perhaps the worst damage caused in the last 5 years was not a single ruling of the government saying one diversion of a forest. It perhaps is very good to have a diversion. Maybe it was some small decision they take on the finance side at one day, which drifted away 40,000 crores from working on energy efficiency, which in the long run will impact us longer. I think we are incapable of understanding these long trajectories of connecting the dots. We are also much more problematic is conveying it in languages, because English is not our language, is not the language that people think in. The metaphors, so again, what's the language for climate change in most of our vernaculars? We don't have a phrase for climate change. So these are new things that are arising on our challenges. It's difficult to convey them. It's fair that we'll face these challenges. But again, I think it's not so difficult compared to other people. Imagine somebody who's trying to explain fiscal deficit to an average citizen saying this will screw your taxes for the next 10 years. The poor chap is dead. We are still trying to say you will get hurt by climate change tomorrow morning. So I don't think it's so tough. We are incapable, and I think we should agree that, we have not done a good job. The next lot will perhaps.
Sorry, we're out of time, but the panelists are available. We're all available, and unfortunately, we have to wind up there.